We are Plum Creek, and we are a place where you matter. Our mission here is centered around changed lives, changing lives. We believe this happens through 3 relationships: intimacy with God, intentionality with family, and influence with others. God has something He wants to say specifically to you wherever you are. Our hope is that you will leave encouraged and closer to Him than ever before. We'd love to connect with you online at plumcreekonline.com or on social media, where you can see how Plum Creek is impacting our community and what opportunities we have for you and your family to get connected. If you'd like to support the ministry we're doing here in Castle Rock, the 2 easiest ways are through the Give tab on our website or via your mobile device by texting your dollar amount to the number on the screen. Thanks again for joining us. We hope you'll enjoy this message.
Just another typical Monday morning in Castle Rock, right? I mean, that might look like what happens to you. Or maybe you're headed into work and that Subaru Outback seems to just kind of pull in front of you and cut you off. I've got a buddy that says, really, he believes that about 70% of the accidents that happen in Colorado are a result of a Subaru Outback pulling in front of you and just ticking you off. And so we're in the final week of our series, Necessary Sins. And you might be going, okay, wait a second, what is a necessary sin? This might be your first time. You haven't been here over this last few months, and you're going, necessary sin, how does that even make sense? Well, know this, there's some sins that if we just kind of said them out loud, every single one of us would probably be able to stack hands, raise hands, and go, you know what, those sins are always wrong. Those things should always be avoided. They have no part in anything, like murder, always wrong. Rape, always wrong. Stealing, wrong. But then there's some other sins that fall into a whole other category. They're kind of more tolerated, and even some of them would probably say, you know what, these are acceptable sins. These are okay to kind of have. And so we've looked at 3 of these over the last month. Starting off, we talked about lying. And we said that God delights in those that speak the truth. And then we looked at gossip, and we were challenged to only speak what is helpful. And then we looked at lust. And in a culture that is saturated with images and different ways to be able to indulge this, we said we've got to run from sexual temptation, and we've got to run to God. Run away from this and run to and get closer to God. And if you've missed any of these, or maybe, along the line, you might find yourself in a spot where you need kind of a refresher course. All of these are online. You can check them out, look at them again, and just be challenged over and over again. And I think for this series, it's been a good one, but it's also been difficult. It's been hard to hear some of this stuff and even to talk about some of this stuff, because it seems to hit too close to home. It's almost like you're going, okay, wait, did Plum Creek just hack my email? Or do they have like cameras posted in my car or in my room or at my workplace? How do they know that this stuff is just kind of churning in me? I don't know, maybe for you, maybe it's ingrained in the culture you find yourself at work or at school or with friends. And so as we dive into this last week, I want us to begin like we begin every other weekend. We've started off with a prayer from King David to kind of prepare our hearts for what God is going to tell us and what He's going to speak into us. And so if you're comfortable with it, I want to invite you to pray with me and to say it out loud. We're going to pray right now, Psalms 139, and it says this: "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life." Now, as you probably figured out by the video, we're talking about anger this week. And anger is one of the more obvious of our necessary sins list. And it's also, I think, probably one of the most destructive for those that have anger poured out on them and for those that either spew it or stuff it. I mean, everybody in here probably falls in one of those 2 categories when you're dealing with anger. You're either a spewer or you're a stuffer, and we kind of put it deep down inside. But I think it's important to know this about anger, is that I don't think it's necessarily bad in and of itself. I mean, God created us with the ability to feel it, right? It's not like we just kind of decided, oh, I just want to be angry today. No, God created us, He hardwired us to be able to feel certain emotions, and anger is one of those. Jesus felt it. He even expressed it when he came into the temple courtyards and he sees that the Pharisees were turning this holy place, this holy ground, into a marketplace. And he starts, throwing tables over and just lashing out at the Pharisees. He knows it. He felt it. We can't control when we feel it building up inside of us. It just happens. It begins to kind of well up. There's also even a righteous anger. A righteous anger that when we hear about something, it maddens us in such a way that we feel like, you know what? I've got to do something about it. I can no longer sit idly by and just let this happen. For some of you, you've gotten involved with South Ridge Elementary because of a righteous anger and said, you know what? It's not right. And so we're going to step in. Others of you, it's been One Child Matters, where you've adopted kids and you said, you know what? It's not okay for them to not have some of the essentials of life. And so you stepped into that. And in fact, next week, we're going to have a One Child Matters weekend. And we're going to have the pastor of the church in Honduras that we partner with that leads the child development center that we built. And he's going to be here to speak about it, about the impact that Plum Creek is having in Honduras. Or maybe it's been human trafficking or adoption and foster care, clean water, racial reconciliation, attacking debt in your life. Or maybe it's working with students, where you've seen students or you've heard about students who have just struggled with their own self-worth, with feeling like, man, you know what? Does it even matter that I'm on this earth? And you said, it's not okay. And so you said, yes, I want to step into that. I want to walk alongside them. I want them to know that they are created a treasure to God. And so you've stepped into this. Why? Because there's been a righteous anger that has been inside of you, and that's okay. That's a good thing. But there's also a sinful anger that we deal with. At some level, I think every single one of us deals with sinful anger in some kind of arena of our life. And it's the anger that wells up when we feel that we're wronged, where we're hurt, and we're taken advantage of. It's the type of anger that's easily justified by ourselves and even probably a group of friends around us that say, you know what, they did you wrong. And so, yeah, you should be angry at this because they've taken something from you. And we need to let them know that they owe us. Because anytime that we are wronged, anytime we are hurt, it's like a debt has been created. And we want somebody to pay. And sometimes we don't even care who it is, but somebody is going to pay. That's going to be around us because we are owed. There is a debt and it needs to be made right. And we feel it's necessary to either unleash our anger on those that have offended us, or we're going to stuff it down and we're going to put it on that little shelf of victimization that we kind of hold for all time. But in actuality, it's that shelf that kind of holds us hostage and keeps us from moving past it and holds us in a place where we're not able to heal. This type of anger, it almost becomes a lens at which we view others and the world. I don't know about you, but this year I've had to deal with something that I never thought I would have to deal with in my life. I just thought I was going to be immune to this. And I found myself sitting down and one of my kids comes up to me and says, you know what, I've got this headache. And so I go and I get an ibuprofen bottle and I take it down and I'm looking at it and try to determine, okay, how much should they have in order to deal with this headache? And I look down at it and it's like all the words just kind of go, they're just fuzzy, right? And I can't read it. And I'm just like, oh, that's just for my mom. I never thought what is it? I've always been able to read little letters and in low light, it doesn't matter. That's my mom. She has the Batman utility belt with readers that come out from everywhere, and put them on there and be able to read it and does the alligator arm thing. But now I'm sitting here struggling with it. And so I realized, man, there's going to come a time when I'm going to have to let go of my stubbornness and actually go to an optometrist. And he's probably going to get out one of these things, or he's going to have this huge machine, where he puts on different lenses to determine how I can see the world, right? And they put on these things, and I can't see a thing. I can just kind of see like little fuzzy figures that are sitting in chairs. But our anger, man, when it becomes something that dominates us, it becomes this lens, and everything else, maybe you've heard that term, that you see red. Everything is affected. All the things that people say, all the actions that happen around you come through this lens and come through this filter of this anger that is built up inside of you. And so how do we begin to stop approaching life and change our lens in that? Because when anger dominates, we approach life and love and relationships all looking to be paid. Because anger says that you owe me, that I am owed, and it doesn't matter who's gonna pay. And so today I want us to look at how do we change that lens? That's our main thought. How do we change the lens by which we view others and the world? How do we get anger out of there? How do we move from seeing things fuzzy to seeing things clear, to seeing it with the heart and the eyes of the Father? Now, it's not surprising to me that when we're talking about anger, and to be honest, it's a little maddening, that the answer to the question of how do we deal with our anger comes through forgiveness. You see, guilty people need to get in the habit of confessing, but angry people need to be in the habit of developing forgiveness in their life. Some of you might be thinking, you know what, I've tried forgiving, Kyle, and you know it hasn't really changed anything. I've tried to forgive. I find forgiveness kind of confusing because I find myself stuck in between believing that I ought to forgive, but not really having the courage to do it. I kind of feel stuck between feeling that if I forgive them, it's going to let the offender off the hook, and that is not right. Or maybe you're confused because you've claimed to have gone through the motions of forgiveness, but those old feelings and those old memories just seem to creep back in, and it leads me to wonder if I've ever even forgiven in the first place. So in the middle of this seemingly impossible trap, we see Paul, the Apostle Paul, writes to the Christ followers in Ephesus, and he gives what seems to be an unreasonable demand. And so in Ephesians 4, verse 31, he says this: get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. And it's a command here. It's not just a helpful suggestion. It's just not like, oh, here, you might want to do this. This is a command. He's saying get rid of all of it. But that doesn't even make sense. I mean, how do we get rid of an emotion that we're not in control of when something is done to us and how we feel? Well, the Greek term here that is translated get rid of means to remove or to separate yourself from. Now, in order for you to get the right picture of this, I want you to think of this. All of us probably at some point in our life, we've been kind of, walking along and we encounter a spider web. You walk through a spider web. Anybody ever walk through a spider web? And it's crazy. It's like this little creature like webs a blanket that just kind of lays down all over you, and it's so sticky. Now, when that thing happens, it's not like we go, oh, here, let me get this one strand off. Oh, here we go. There's that. And we kind of just peel it off one little layer by layer. No, it's like you walk through that thing, you feel the stickiness on you, and it's like, you got to get it off, right? It's just like, ugh. It freaks you out, and you try to get as fast as possible. You try to get all those spider webs completely off of you. That's what Paul's talking about here when he's saying, get rid of everything. And in Paul fashion, he then proceeds to add this one small word that is so huge. He says all, and then he connects it to a list of every relational wedge that he can think of. But how can Paul ask us to do this? I mean, he doesn't know my past. He doesn't know my story. I'm simply reacting to what has been done to me. It's not my fault that my boss is incompetent. It's not my fault that my wife or my husband enjoys hanging out with the gang at work more than the gang at home. It's not my fault that my innocence was stolen. He doesn't know my story. Why? How can he sit there on his little righteous, pious hill as the apostle with the power of God flowing through him and tell me to get rid of all this bitterness and anger? Think about what Paul was going through, though, when he was writing this. He was sitting in a cell in a Roman prison, unjustly arrested, extradited to Rome, and he had to wait over a year for a trial for him to get out. You think Paul would have some kind of reason as he's sitting here writing this to be bitter, to have rage, to have anger, to have all kind of sorts of thoughts of malicious behavior? But yet here he is, and he's saying, here's what we need to do. We've got to get rid of all of this stuff. And then he writes this. He continues in verse 32, and he says, instead, be kind to each other, tenderhearted. And here comes that key, right? Forgiving one another. In contrast to the bitterness and the rage, Paul calls us to be kind and tenderhearted to those that have wronged us. And the way that we can do that is through forgiveness. To being able to show this kindness, show this compassion is only by forgiving one another. And if the verse stopped there, it would be really easy for every single one of us to retreat back to our list of wrongs and go, you know what? Here, I really am justified by feeling this way because look at what has happened to me. But that verse doesn't stop there. It continues on and it says, just as. So be kind to each other, tenderhearted, forgiving one another. And the key right there, bold that just as, underline it, circle it, whatever. Just as God through Christ has forgiven you. That's the way that we can forgive. Not because they deserve it, because the people that wronged you, the people that take something from you, the people that you feel like owed you, yes, they are undeserving of forgiveness. Just like we were undeserving of forgiveness when Christ died on a cross so that you and I could have mess ups, so that we could fall short, so that we could even experience some of the things that we experience. He died for all of that. And we are undeserving of that mercy and of that grace. And so he says, just as Christ forgave you through the cross, you are to forgive others. Be kind, be tenderhearted, show compassion. You see, without the cross, we might not be able to extend the type of forgiveness that leads us to healing. See, us forgiving people that have wronged us is more about you being able to get past it and to heal than it is letting them off the hook. Because if we don't forgive, we're going to be stuck with that lens. We're going to be stuck viewing life and others through a lens of pain, a lens of anger, and a lens of hurt. But with the phrase just as, it gives us the ability to rid our hearts of this bitterness and this resentment that have the potential to wreak havoc on every single important relationship in your life. It's through forgiveness and through the cross that we're able to forgive. Andy Stanley, in his book, Enemies of the Heart, which is a great book and inspired a lot of what's in this message, says this: in the shadow of my hurt, forgiveness feels like a decision to reward my enemy. But in the shadow of the cross, forgiveness is merely a gift from one undeserving soul to another. Know this, that you will never ever have a conversation, have an interaction, sit across a table with anyone who deserves forgiveness. Every single person you come in contact with, every single person I have a conversation with, all of us are undeserving souls. All of us have fallen short. But in the light of the cross, in light of his grace and in light of his mercy, we are forgiven, and he calls us to forgive. You see, Christ followers, we are called and liberated to view people, to view forgiveness through the lens of the cross, and it changes the way that we see it. But it doesn't happen overnight. It's not like you're going to be able to just kind of walk out of these doors and snap your fingers and then all of a sudden it's just going to be okay and the wrongs are going to be all right. No, it's a process that we have to go through. And the first step on that process is determine and identify who you're angry with. Identify who you're angry with. Make a list. Make a list. Anyone who has ever mistreated you, taken advantage of you, hurt you, go back as far as you want to go back. But make a list. And don't assume that you've forgiven someone just because you put it behind you. Just because it's not gurgling up every single day now, just because it's not so fresh, don't think that, oh, it's just done. That's just stuffing it under a rug. And then there's that thing that triggers it, and then it just kind of explodes in your life. If you're making your list, think about this. Who do you hope to never see again? Who would you be okay with? I am totally fine if I never have to see that person ever again. Who do you find yourself having imaginary conversations with and always winning? Because you are so witty and you know exactly the right comeback at the right time and it just shuts that person down and then they just fall at your feet and go, oh, I was so wrong. Who would you like to pay back if you knew that you could get away with it? If you knew that you couldn't get caught? Who is that? Who do you secretly desire to see fail? And the answer is that's identifying who's making it onto that list. Identify who's wrong with you. Poke around every single area of your life. It could be relatives, family, friends. Maybe it's an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, an ex-husband or wife, a deceased parent, work associates, coaches, bosses. This is an opportunity for you to purge your heart of the junk that has been hindering the relationships that you value the most. So identify who that is. Make your list. The second step of that process is determine what they owe. Be specific. Now, most people like to skip this part. They just kind of forgive generally. I just generally forgive you. You know what the person took from you, and you know how they hurt you. So then identify exactly, specifically, what they took. Because until you know the answer to this question, you may go through the motions of forgiveness, but you might not experience the freedom that comes from it. You see, general forgiveness doesn't heal specific hurts. And so identify, determine what they owe you. What do they need to return? What do they need to put back so that everything is going to be the way that it was? Is it an apology? Is it money? Is it time? A marriage? Maybe it's a family, a job, a reputation, a promotion, a chapter, a season of life. You cannot cancel a debt that you haven't clearly identified yet. So identify, what do they owe you? Those two parts can be a little difficult, but it's easier than this next step. This next step might sting a little bit. Because the next step in the process is then you cancel that debt. You cancel the debt. You decide that the offending party doesn't owe you anything anymore, just as Christ canceled your debt, your sin debt, in order to have a relationship with the creator of the universe and enjoy an eternity with him in heaven. You are going to cancel the debt of the person that has wronged you. And you know what? It's not easy. The disciples had issues with this. Peter comes to Jesus and he says, okay, hey, how many times do I need to forgive? I want a limit on this. I'm fine with going ahead and saying, hey, I forgive you, 1 or 2 times, but this guy just keeps coming back. How many times, Jesus? Is it 7? Is it 7 times? And Jesus says, no, it's 70 times 7. And then he tells Peter this story. He says, there's this king, and he brings his servants in that had borrowed money from him, and he's going to settle his accounts once and for all. And he brings in this one servant that owes him millions and says, there's no possible way that you're going to be able to repay this, so I'm going to sell you, your wife, your kids, your dog, your house, all of your possessions. I'm going to take it, and I'm going to use that to settle a portion of what you owe me. And the servant looks at him, and he just falls down on his knees, and he said, I can't pay that. Please don't do that. And he pleads, and he begs for mercy. And the king looks at him and says, you know what? Okay, I'm going to have mercy on you. Your debt is canceled. It's wiped out. And then the same servant that has just had millions forgiven walks out into the streets and finds somebody that owes him and requires him to pay him back. This guy owes him about in the thousands. And that man falls at the feet of the servant and says, I can't pay this. Please have mercy. And he's like, no, I'm going to throw you in jail. And he's like, no, please have mercy. And he takes him by the throat and puts him up against the wall and says, no, you're headed to jail. You need to pay me back every single thing that you owe me. Well, the other servants see what's going on. They tell the king, and the king brings that other servant that he had just forgiven. He brings him back into the court and said, how in the world can you do this to somebody else who owes you a little when I forgave you so very much? And he throws the servant into prison, and he says, you're going to be tortured until your debt is repaid. And then Jesus tacks on at the end, he says, this is how you're going to feel when you face my Father if you have not forgiven, because he has forgiven you so much. Just as my Father has forgiven you, you need to forgive others. You cancel the debt. This might be as simple for you as a quiet moment in your own heart and just saying, you know what? The debt is canceled. I've identified who that is. I've specifically lined out this is what is owed, and now I'm canceling this debt, and you just do that. Or maybe you need something a little more tangible. Maybe you need to sit down at your table and put an empty chair across from you and have a conversation with a person even though they're not there. And go down the list of ways that they have wronged you or the ways that they have offended you and hurt you and what they have taken from you, and then declare them forgiven and then leave it there. Maybe you need to write a list and burn it or bury it or nail it to a cross, whatever you need to do with it. Put it in the garbage disposal, whatever it is. But you need to be done with it. Because I think a ton of us, we hold on to those hurts and we hold on to that anger so much so that it becomes a character. It becomes this character flaw that is in us that just continues to work its way up. It becomes a part of our story about who we are. And anytime something triggers it, it just boils up inside of us. We've got to cancel that debt. And maybe all of us need to have just like a little phrase that we go through, because daily there's going to be things that you're going to feel wronged or you're going to feel hurt. There's going to be times when you pull into, your workplace and, Jimmy is in your spot again, and he knows it's your spot and he's been parking there all week and you've been complaining about it for a whole entire week and you're just like, this can't happen again. I'm about to go in there and just let Jimmy have it. Maybe you just need to sit in your car for a second and just say, Heavenly Father, Jimmy has taken my spot from me again. I have held on to this debt long enough. I choose to cancel the debt. Jimmy doesn't owe me anymore. Just as you forgave me, I forgive Jimmy. And you could fill in the blanks with whatever that is for you. But cancel the debt. And then the final step in that process is dismiss the case. It's a daily decision to wake up and say, you know what? I'm not going to reopen this wound again. I'm not going to reopen this case. And know this, our feelings are not going to automatically follow our decision to forgive. You're not going to automatically, you could go through all these steps and it's not going to be like, oh, finally, it's like rainbows and unicorns, or it's amazing and life is good now. No, it's going to take a little bit for your feelings to catch up with your decision to forgive. It's not going to erase the memories. And so when a memory triggers, here's what I want you to do. I want you to face it and feel it. Again, the emotion is not the bad part. It's what we do after it and what we do with it. Remind yourself then of the declaration that you made to say that he or she doesn't owe me anymore. And the only way to do that is to look to God. It is his Spirit at work in us that gives us the ability to forgive just as we have been forgiven. So we thank him for his forgiveness. We thank him for that ability to forgive. And then we've got to not fall for the lie. The enemy's going to try to trick you up in this whole process. Don't fall for the lie that you haven't truly forgiven just because of your emotions and your feelings. So as we close out this series, I want us to not only change our lens when it comes to anger, but we need to change our lens when it comes to lying, to gossip, to lust. Because here's what happens. When we lie, it's because we see ourselves as condemned. We see ourselves as man, we're not good enough, and so we've got to hide the places that we fall short. We've got to hide and cover that up. Not really relying on that. We have already been forgiven. We have a creator in heaven that is taking care of that. And so we've got to change that lens. Stop looking at ourselves as condemned. And when we gossip, we see that gossip leads us to see ourselves as less than. And so we begin to talk down other people so that we might feel raised up. You don't need to feel less than anymore. You have to change that lens. Lust leads us to feel and see ourselves as dissatisfied, like there is something else in our life that could satisfy us more. And with anger, it leads to see ourselves as owed. But just like this optometrist, when he begins to take some of these lenses out that cause us to be fuzzy, he begins to replace them with different lenses until we see clearly. You see, when we begin to look to God, and he begins to kind of change the way that we see ourselves, changes the way that we see others, and we begin to see the world with his heart and his eyes. We move from feeling and seeing ourselves as condemned, and we see ourselves as accepted. We no longer have to see ourselves as less than. We can see ourselves as a masterpiece, a treasure that was worth dying for. We can kind of change our lens from being dissatisfied to being content, and we can change our lens from being owed to being forgiven. And when that happens, you begin to experience freedom and you begin to heal. and you begin to see the world as God sees it. So we've got to look to the cross in order to change our lens. One of the ways that can help us remember the forgiveness that we have been given, the just as we have been forgiven, is through communion. And so our ushers are going to come forward now. They're going to pass out the elements. I want you to hold on to them for just a second, okay? Because here's what I want you to do. I just want us to spend just a moment, and I want you to spend a moment with your Creator. And I want you to kind of look back over this last month, these last things, these lenses that we've been talking about, these necessary sins that we've been talking about. And ask God to kind of pull out what in you needs to take a step towards healing. What lens in you needs to change in order for you to see clearly with His heart and His eyes? Because when you're ready to change, when you're ready to kind of take that step, I want you to take then the bread that symbolizes His body that's been broken for you, and the cup that symbolizes His blood being spilled. And ask God in your quiet moment, just right now, when you're ready, you take it and you look to the cross and you begin to change your lens.